Chapter 6, The Buying and Selling of Labor Power, Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Why does Marx, in Capital Chapter 6, insist that your boss never once cheats you, follows every law to the letter, and still walks away richer every single day? That is the whole chapter, in one sentence. And today we are going to slow it down, take it apart, and put it back together with the guilds, with the gig economy, with scrum boards, and with your own last performance review.
Before we start, who are we even reading? Because Does Capital has a reputation for being a book people own, quote, and never actually finish.
Fair. Karl Marx, born in 1818 in Trier, trained as a philosopher, exiled from Germany, exiled from France, ended up in London writing in the reading room of the British Museum for decades. Capital, Volume 1, came out in 1867. It is not a pamphlet. It is closer to a very long, very patient autopsy of how 19th century capitalism actually worked, mechanism by mechanism. And Chapter 6 is where the autopsy gets personal, because this is the chapter where he stops talking about commodities in general and starts talking about the one commodity that happens to be you. Part 1, The Riddle of Fair Exchange. How can you and your boss shake hands on a perfectly fair deal, and only one of you ends up owning a yacht? Marx starts Chapter 6 almost gently. He walks into the labor market the way a tourist walks into a beautiful old square, admiring the architecture. He calls this square, and this is his own phrase, a very Eden of the innate rights of man, ruled only by freedom, equality, property, and bentham. Freedom, because both sides agree to the contract of their own free will. Equality, because both sides sign it as equal owners. One owns money, the other owns their own capacity to work. Property, because each side is simply trading something that belongs to them. And bentham, a little joke on Marx's part, because bentham is the philosopher of self-interest. Everyone here is just pursuing their own advantage, and somehow that is supposed to add up to the common good.
So on paper, this sounds like the fairest transaction in the world. Two free people meeting as equals, trading something for something else.
Exactly, and that is the trap Marx is setting for the reader. He wants you to admit out loud that the surface of the deal really is fair. He is not accusing anyone of lying, or cheating, or breaking a contract. Why does the fairest deal you ever signed still leave you tired, and your boss rich? That is the riddle. Because classical economists before Marx, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, had already built most of the theory that value comes from labor. If a coat takes twice as long to make as a hat, the coat should be worth roughly twice as much. That is the labor theory of value, and Smith and Ricardo both use versions of it. But neither of them fully explained where profit comes from, if everyone is trading fairly at fair prices for fair labor time. Ricardo saw the puzzle. He never quite cracked it.
Can you make that concrete? Because right now it still sounds abstract.
Think about a barista. She is paid, let's say, 12 euros an hour. In that hour, she makes coffee that the shop sells for maybe 80 or 90 euros worth of drinks, once you count the whole shift's output divided across the hour. The shop still has to pay for beans, rent, machines, all of that. But at the end of the quarter, the coffee chain reports a profit. Someone somewhere made money on top of every single cost, including her wage. Nobody underpaid her relative to the going wage. Nobody broke a contract. And yet value appeared out of nowhere, on the company's side of the ledger, not hers.
And this isn't new, right? This is not a 21st century coffee shop problem.
Not remotely new. Think about the collapse of the medieval guild system. Under the guilds, a journeyman worked toward becoming a master, owned his tools, controlled his own pace, sold a finished product, a chair, a shoe, a coat. The relationship was tight, personal, and bounded by tradition. When the guild system broke down, across the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, workers stopped selling finished things. They started selling time itself, under a new kind of contract, the employment contract where you are paid by the hour or the week, not by the object you produce. And there is a wider backdrop to this shift too. In the early 1800s, Britain was consumed by the debate over the Corn Laws, tariffs that kept grain prices high to protect landowners. The people who wanted those tariffs abolished called themselves the Party of Free Trade and Free Labor. Marx watched this debate closely because free trade and free labor were being sold as the same kind of freedom, the freedom of the market, when in practice they served very different classes very differently. So keep that Eden in your head. Free, equal, property owners, both of them meeting on the market square as, quote, free persons, who are equal before the law. Because the entire rest of this chapter is Marx walking you out of that square, down a side street, and through a door that most economists of his time preferred not to open.
Which door is that?
The door marked what exactly is being sold here, which brings us to Part 2. Part 2, what you actually sell. You are not selling your work. You are renting yourself out by the hour. This is the hinge of the whole chapter, and it is a distinction so simple it is almost embarrassing once you see it. Marx says the worker does not sell labor. The worker sells labor power. Two different things. Labor is the actual doing, the coffee being made, the code being written, the box being packed. Labor power is something else. Marx defines it precisely as the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in a human being, which that person sets in motion whenever they produce something.
Explain that like I am 5, please.
Imagine renting a car. When you rent it, you are not paying for a specific journey. You are paying for the ability to drive it for a fixed number of hours wherever the renter directs you. What you do with those hours, how many kilometers you actually drive, is a separate question from the rental fee itself. Labor power is exactly that. It is the car sitting there full of potential. Labor is the actual driving. The wage buys the car for 8 hours. What the employer gets out of those 8 hours, how many kilometers, how much value created, that is a different number entirely, and it is not fixed by the rental price.
So the gap between those two numbers, the rental price and the actual mileage, that is where profit comes from.
That is exactly where profit comes from. And Marx knew this needed a sharper contrast, so he reaches for slavery, deliberately, as an uncomfortable but clarifying comparison. Under Roman slavery, or under plantation slavery in the antebellum American South, the whole person is bought once for life. The slaveholder owns the body permanently, and therefore has to feed, house, and maintain that body indefinitely, the way you would maintain a piece of equipment you plan to keep for decades. Wage labor restructures this completely. The worker is never owned. Instead, the worker is rented, in daily or weekly installments, over and over, for an entire working life. Marx's point is sharp, almost cruel on both sides at once. Wage labor is a genuine advance in human freedom because nobody owns your body. But it reproduces something like the old extraction in a new legal costume because your time, sliced into installments, gets sold again, and again and again with no end date.
Can you give a modern version of that installment idea?
Think about an Uber driver. He is renting out two things at once. The car obviously on a lease or a loan. But also, and this is the labor power part, the next several hours of his own body, his attention, his reflexes, his willingness to be available whenever the app pings him. The platform is not buying a finished, completed set of trips in advance. It is buying his readiness, his capacity, for the length of the shift, and then extracting as many trips out of that readiness as the algorithm can manage. Compare that to a freelance illustrator selling one finished poster for a fixed price. That transaction is closer to the old guild model. A finished object changes hands. The moment you are paid for time, availability, or presence, rather than a finished thing, you have crossed into the labor power side of Marx's distinction.
So even something as modern as an app-based gig job is still, underneath, following a very old pattern.
Precisely the same pattern, just with a smartphone instead of a factory gate. And that pattern needs one more condition to exist at all, which is what Part 3 is about. Part 3, doubly free. Freedom, it turns out, comes in two flavors, and only one of them feels like freedom. Marx makes a claim here that sounds almost like wordplay until you sit with it. For the labor market to exist at all, the worker must be free in what he calls the double sense. Free, first, in the sense we usually mean, free to sell their own labor power to whichever employer they choose, unlike a slave, who belongs to no particular owner and cannot be sold by someone else against their will. But free, second, in a much colder sense. Free of meaning stripped of any land, tools, or means of production of their own. No farm to work. No workshop to run. Nothing to fall back on except the labor power inside their own body.
So the first freedom sounds good, and the second one is actually a kind of forced dependence.
Exactly, and history shows this being manufactured, quite deliberately, over centuries. Take the English Enclosure Acts, running from roughly the 15th century through the early 1800s, but accelerating hard in the 1700s. Common land, land that villagers had grazed animals on and grown food on for generations, was fenced off, privatized, and handed to landlords, often through acts of parliament. Peasants who had been, in a rough sense, self-sufficient, lost that self-sufficiency almost overnight. They became free, in Marx's first sense, free to go wherever they liked. And they became free in his second, colder sense too, because they now had nothing except their own two hands to sell. The result, over time, was a flood of people into the new factory towns of Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, exactly the doubly free workforce industrial capitalism needed to function.
Was there a similar pattern outside England?
The Scottish Highland clearances, mostly through the 1700s and 1800s, followed a comparable logic, landlords clearing tenant farmers off the land to make room for more profitable sheep grazing, pushing entire communities toward the coast, toward emigration, or toward wage labor in the growing cities. And there is a subtler, more painful example too. After the American Civil War, formerly enslaved people gained legal freedom, the first kind of freedom, completely and rightly. But most gained nothing of the second kind. No land, no tools, no capital. What emerged across much of the South was sharecropping, where former slaves worked land owned by former slaveholders, in exchange for a share of the crop, permanently indebted through supplies and seed bought on credit from the landowner. Formally free, practically bound to the same fields, and often the same families, for generations.
That is a genuinely uncomfortable comparison to sit with.
It is meant to be. Marx is not saying wage labor equals slavery. He explicitly says it does not. The worker belongs to no particular master and can walk away from any single employer. But he is insisting that legal freedom, on its own, tells you almost nothing about whether someone has a real alternative to selling their time. And this brings us straight into the present. Gig economy workers today are classified, quite deliberately, as independent contractors. Free in the first sense, to log on or log off whenever they like. But without health coverage, without a pension, without protection if the app simply deactivates their account tomorrow. Doubly free in exactly Marx's sense, free to choose, and free of any cushion if that choice goes wrong.
And this idea of manufactured freedom, it shows up inside companies too, doesn't it? Not just in who gets hired.
It does, and it is worth naming directly. Consider how modern management invites employees to set their own goals through frameworks like OKRs, objectives, and key results. On the surface, this looks like autonomy. You choose your own targets. You are not simply handed a quota from above. But look closer. The categories you are choosing within, the metrics that count as success, the deadlines, all of that is still set by someone else, further up the chain. You are free to choose your target, the way a Highland tenant was free to choose which ship to emigrate on. Real choice, inside a frame you did not build and cannot leave. So now we have the two freedoms in place. Free to sell, free of anything else to fall back on, which means we can finally ask the question this whole chapter has been circling. If someone is renting out their labor power, what actually decides the price? Part 4. What decides the price of a person's time? Your wage is not what you are worth. It is what it costs to keep you coming back tomorrow. Marx applies the same logic to labor power that classical economists applied to every other commodity. The value of a thing is roughly the labor time needed to produce it. So what is the labor time needed to produce a worker ready to show up on Monday morning? His answer precisely stated, the value of labor power is determined by the labor time socially necessary to produce the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of the worker. Food, housing, clothing, enough to keep the body functioning and able to work again tomorrow.
That sounds almost mechanical, like feeding a machine.
It would be, except Marx adds one crucial complication, and this is where the chapter gets genuinely subtle. He says subsistence includes what he calls a historical and moral element. Not a fixed biological minimum, the way you would calculate calories for livestock, but a socially expected standard of living, one that shifts across time and place. What counted as an acceptable minimum wage in 1850 London is not what counts as acceptable in Berlin or Karlsruhe today. Expectations move. A telephone was a luxury a century ago. Today, in most of the developed world, going without a phone or internet access can functionally exclude you from the labor market altogether. The floor keeps rising, but it is always still a floor, set by what society currently considers the bare minimum for a working life, not by some fixed and eternal number.
Is there a historical example where this got made explicit, where the state basically wrote the subsistence floor into law?
The Speen-Hamlin system, introduced in England in 1795. Wages for agricultural laborers had fallen so low that parishes began topping them up out of the poor rates, tied to the price of bread and the size of a worker's family. It was, in effect, an early wage subsidy. And it produced a fierce debate that echoes almost exactly through today's arguments about minimum wage laws and universal basic income. Does topping up low wages help workers, or does it simply let employers pay less, knowing the parish, or today, the state, will cover the difference? There is an even starker historical example, the company town. Coal and mill towns across 19th century Britain and the United States often paid workers partly in scrip, a form of company-issued currency, spendable only at the company store, at prices the company itself controlled. Workers could be nominally well paid and still permanently indebted, because the entire subsistence loop, wage, spending, and debt, was owned by the same employer.
And the modern equivalent of that historical and moral element, what does that look like today?
Minimum wage debates almost everywhere run on exactly this logic. Should the minimum track inflation? Should it reflect the actual cost of housing in a given city or a flat national number? And there is a piece of this Marx did not have to reckon with as directly unpaid domestic labor. Someone has to cook, clean, and raise the next generation of workers, largely unpaid, historically and still disproportionately women's labor, invisible on any company balance sheet, yet absolutely essential to producing tomorrow's workforce. Feminist economists in the 20th century picked up exactly this thread from Marx's subsistence argument and pushed it further than he did. Now here is where modern management enters again and does something genuinely clever with this historical and moral element. The base wage covers survival, the floor. But bonus structures, performance-related pay, commission on targets, these are dangled as the extra, the taste of the better life. Marx says every generation expects a little more of. Somewhere between clocking in and clocking out, a few hours go missing, and nobody files a police report. The bonus reframes the wage entirely. It stops looking like payment for rented time and starts looking like a reward for merit, for excellence, for hitting a number you supposedly chose yourself. Which makes the whole underlying relationship, rented time, priced at subsistence plus a historical extra, much harder to see, because it now feels earned, not paid. And that disguise, that shift from wage to merit, from time rented to goals achieved, is exactly what carries us into the final part of the chapter, and its least comfortable conclusion. Part 5. The unpaid hours and the uncomfortable conclusion. The most efficient theft in history needed no thief. We are finally ready for the sentence Chapter 6 has been building toward across 4 parts. Marx describes the moment the wage contract is signed, out in the open market, in almost theatrical terms. The money owner and the worker leave what he calls the noisy sphere of the market, where everything takes place on the surface, in full view of everyone, and they walk instead into what he calls the hidden abode of production. Above its entrance, he writes, hangs a sign. No admittance except on business.
Why does the location matter so much to him? Why not just describe the exploitation directly?
Because the location is the entire argument. Out in the market square, everything was fair, visible, and equal. Behind that door in the workshop, the factory, the office, something changes, and it changes without anyone breaking a single law. Marx says we shall now see whether the money owner and the owner of labor power, walking through that door, remain the same two figures we met on the market. His implication, quietly devastating, is that they do not. One walks in as a buyer. The other walks in as, in every practical sense, someone who now has to obey.
And this is where the working day fights come in, historically.
Exactly. If labor power is rented by the hour, or the day, then every additional hour extracted beyond what is needed to cover the worker's own subsistence is pure surplus for the employer. And that is the entire 19th century fight over the length of the working day, condensed into one sentence. Britain's Factory Acts, passed in stages across the 1830s and 40s, tried to cap hours, first for children, then gradually for adults. The 10 Hours Act of 1847 is the landmark, a rare case of the state stepping directly between employer and worker to say, this rental has a legal limit. Employers fought it bitterly, arguing in language that still echoes today, that shorter hours would destroy competitiveness and cost jobs.
And today, we do not usually fight over the length of the working day the same way. So has that battle just ended?
It has changed shape more than it has ended. Consider automation and artificial intelligence today. When a task that once took a human worker an hour can now be done by a machine or a model in a few seconds, the productivity gain is enormous. The 19th century question returns immediately in a new form: who captures that gain? The worker, through shorter hours or higher pay for the same output? Or the owner of the machine, through the same hours worked at the same wage, but producing many times more value than before?
And the gig economy fits back in here too, doesn't it? The algorithm as a kind of new foreman.
Precisely. Delivery and rideshare platforms often set per task piece rates through an algorithm, adjusting pay in real time based on demand, driver availability, and how much desperation the system can detect in the local labor pool. It is framed, constantly, as flexibility, work whenever you like. But underneath the framing sits the oldest question in the chapter. Is the price paid enough to cover a decent version of that historical and moral subsistence floor? Or is flexibility simply a modern word for a Speen-Hamlin-style top-up problem, minus the parish safety net? Now back to Scrum and stand-ups, because this is where the disguise reaches its most refined modern form. Agile methodology, sprint planning, velocity tracking, none of this forces anyone into unpaid overtime directly, and that distinction matters. Nobody is legally coerced. But sprint velocity turns each worker into their own overseer, constantly measuring, reporting, and optimizing their own output on a shared, visible board that the whole team can see. The daily stand-up is a small, almost gentle ritual, and yet it is structurally similar to a foreman's walk through a 19th-century factory floor, except now, each worker narrates their own progress out loud, voluntarily, to their peers, rather than being checked by someone above them. That is Marx's hidden abode of production, redesigned for an open-plan office. No door, no sign, no coercion anyone could point to and call unfair. Just teammates freely, cheerfully, reporting on how efficiently they rented out their own time yesterday.
So where does that actually leave us? What is the conclusion Marx is really building toward across this whole chapter?
Here it is, stated plainly, and this is the part that sits directly against how most people, including most mainstream economists, think about fairness in a market. A wage contract can be entirely legal, entirely voluntary, entirely free of fraud, coercion, or deception. And it can still, systematically, every single day, transfer unpaid labor from the worker to the employer, simply because of how the price of labor power gets set, at subsistence, historical and moral element included, rather than at the full value of what that labor power actually produces once it is put to work. The standard economic view says a freely agreed price is, by definition, a fair price, and that once both sides sign, the story ends there. Marx's Chapter 6 says the story has barely started, because the interesting part happens behind the door marked no admittance except on business, in the hidden abode of production, where value gets created that the wage never fully accounts for.
No villain required, in other words.
No villain required. That is what makes Chapter 6 so much more disturbing than a simple story about greedy bosses. Greed is easy to spot and easy to punish. What Marx describes instead is a structure, built out of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, that produces the same outcome, quietly, patiently, decade after decade, factory floor to Uber app to sprint board, with everyone involved signing every form correctly, and nobody ever needing to lie. And that from the market square through the guild's collapse, past the enclosure acts and the Highland clearances, through Speen-Hamlin and the company store, into the factory acts, and finally through the stand-up meeting on a Tuesday morning, is Chapter 6 of Kapital, Volume 1. The buying and selling of labor power, hiding in plain sight behind a perfectly fair